Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel, and this is the part 4 of the beginner platform series. In this episode, we are going to improve our input handling. This will allow us to implement some tricks I mentioned in my essential platformer tricks video, and improve the player experience. Alright, let's get started. Godot offers different ways to handle input. We can go with an event-driven approach using the input and unhandled input functions. In this approach, we will only handle input when it actually happens. Or we can use a pooling-driven approach, which means that the input is retrieved every frame and then checked. The event-driven approach is powerful, but it comes with a lot of corner cases that I really don't think a beginner should worry about. For this reason, we are going to use the pooling-driven approach, and to do this, we are going to create a script to pull and store the input every frame. And I'm going to be creating this script inside the player folder in the script. And let's call this script input handler. This script will extend from node we're going to put here in the player. Let's create it. We don't need the process or the write function, so let's erase this. And let's put the variables that we want to hold every frame. The one that we'll be using all the time is the X. Another one that we've been using all the time is the jump just pressed. And let's set some default values. So every time that we start a game, we always have something here. Let's create a function, update. This is the function that we are going to call every frame to retrieve the input. We already know how to retrieve inputs for the X and the jump just press. So I will just slide through this. Now, let's go to the player. And let's add a reference to the input handler. The same way that we did for the finite state machine and for the sprite. And let's call it just input. Don't forget to attach the input handler to the node that we just created. In the physics process, before we call the states, let's call the input.update. All right, let's check how we can use this. If we go to the idle, we can make some changes here already. Instead of calling object get input x, you can say object.input.x. But this doesn't change much, because we still need to call object and then input and then x. We can simplify this a bit and make it more readable with a small trick. Let me show you. If you go to the player base state, we can create here a variable. Let's call this variable input. And it would be very nice if we could just say input.x in any state and we get the input x. This is possible if you use getters and setters. We can do it like this. And just like it, if you head back now to the idle state, you can just simplify this by this. And you can also simplify this one, say input jump just pressed. Let's go ahead and change this in the run state as well. And right here. And we can go to the fall as well. And replace this one and this one. We can head back to the player and erase both of these functions. They are no longer needed. And before we go ahead and hit play, we still have some usages of that function. In the player base state, we still do this with the direction. So we can just say input.x, and right here we can do the same, input.x, and this should be all. Now we can hit play. The controls should stay the same. We can still walk and we can still jump. Perfect. Now our player class is much more cleaner. It simply, in the physics process, delegates the responsibility to capture and hold all the input states that we want, the input handler that we just created, and then it calls the finite state machine to handle the logic for the current state. Because later we will be going to put a lot of things into the player and we don't have to worry about inputs or states, only the things that really matters for the player class to handle. With this input handler that we just created, we can implement some really cool stuff that I mentioned in my essential platform tricks video. And one of them is variable jump height and input buffer. And we're going to implement both of them in one go. Stay with me so you don't get lost. To start this, let's create two more variables that we are going to be using. One of them is jump pressed, and this is different from jump just pressed because this one will be true if the player holds down the jump button. This is going to be used to define the variable jump height. If we check for this during the jump and this is false, it means that the player let go of the jump button, and we're going to have another one that is a jump buffer. And this one, as I mentioned in the other video, it will be used to remember that the player pressed the jump button for a short while. Let's say the player is falling and just a few frames before hitting the ground, the player presses the jump button. But because the player is not grounded, when he presses the key, he will not jump if we don't have this technique. With this technique, we can remember that the player pressed the jump for a few frames, and if the player contacts the ground in the time window that we defined, we are going to allow the player to jump right away, and this should feel very responsive for the player. To use the jump buffer, we are going to need a timer. And we're going to put this timer under the input handler. All right, I hope by now you already know how the timer works. So let's just go through it real quick. Physics, we're gonna put it at 0.1, and yes, one shot. Now we need a reference inside the input handler to access this timer. Let's put this reference right here. Let me rename it so it's easier. Or instead of typing, we can just drag and drop this here. All right, now for the cool part. Let's make the jump pressed here. And this is input, is action pressed. And you can see button jump. Nice. And now the little trick that I like to apply here is let's move this one up so we can have these two that they are related, because every time that we just press the key, we want to start a buffer. So let's make a get setter for the jump just pressed. And we are just going to return jump just press here. And for the set, we're going to set the value. And if the value is true, it means that we just pressed it. We're going to say jump buffer. is equals to true. And now for the jump buffer, we're going to go like this. We're going to make a get, and we're going to return the buffer timer is stopped negated. So we're going to return if the buffer timer is ticking, which means that we are in the time frame that we can allow for the jump to happen. And to set this value, what we're going to do is say if you have a value, it means that we just set it as true. We're going to say jump buffer timer dot start. Otherwise, if this is false, we're going to stop the timer. And just like this, that is all we need for the variable jump height and for the input buffer. Now let's head back to the jump and implement the variable jump height. We can do this by doing a variable here. I'll call this variable jump height. And every time that we enter the jump state, we're going to say that this variable is equals to false. And inside the physics update, we're going to do a little check here. We're going to say if we're not the variable jump height, which means that we didn't let go yet of the key, and we are not holding the key, we're going to set the variable jump height true, so we don't enter under this condition more than once. And right here you can do a lot of different things, but since we move this frame and it could happen that the velocity, we already started to fall, I don't want to modify the velocity y if we are already falling. So I'm gonna do a check here for the velocity y, make sure that we are still going up, and then all I'm going to do is divide the velocity y by 2. And this will make the player straight up cut the jump and start falling. Not on this exact frame, but reducing the velocity y half while we are jumping makes a big difference, since the gravity of the jump is very strong. And just like this, we can hit play now. And if we let go, as soon as we jump lower. As you can see, this is me releasing the key very earlier. And if I keep the jump press, I can jump higher. If I don't maintain the key press, I cannot go over this. But if I keep it, I can go over. Nice. This is the first trick that I wanted to implement in this video. The second one is even simpler. Let's go to the fall state. And right here, when we touch the ground, we're going to make a little check before we define if you want to go idle or run. Right here, we can say if input.jump buffer, we can simply change the state to jump. We can do an else here and then an else to go out. Before we hit play here, we need to go back to the jump. And as we enter the jump, we also want to set the jump buffer to false. Because remember that we have this right now. And what can happen is if the player let go of the key in between the frame, we're going to perform the jump and we can land, and this can still be true. So we're going to be in a loop we're gonna jump twice with a single press if we manage to touch the ground before the timer expires. This timer right here. It's not very common, but I've seen it happening. And this is, you can visualize this if you set, for example, the wait time to be 2 or 3 seconds, and then we jump and let go. You see that the player will keep jumping for 2 or 3 seconds if you don't set this as false. Because remember, what we did here, when we set the jump buffer as false, it's going to stop the timer. And then whenever we go to get the value, this is going to be false. All right, now we can hit play. And if I try to jump just before touching the ground, you have to try it for yourself and you feel the difference that it makes. This technique we are going to use also for the attack, so the player can chain attacks easily. And there's just one more detail that I want to add into the jump. Right here, when we set the velocity Y, I want to give the player a boost on the X direction. And we're gonna add the input time the player max speed. So we are going to give the player a little boost in the direction he's pressing the X. And this makes a lot of difference when you try to make the player reach somewhere. And this already feels much better than what we had at the start of the video. And that's it for this video. I hope you guys enjoyed it. And I see you guys on the next one. Bye!